speak to you as part of the 2022 International Energy Conference and Expo in Guyana. I'm sorry not to be there in person. I want to start by expressing my appreciation for all of the work that the people in your region have been a part of over the last 2 years. We could not have achieved the success we did at COP26 without your powerful contributions. We owe a debt of gratitude to the climate vulnerable countries in the region who are at the forefront of the fight to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, often leading the way on both adaptation and mitigation. As you know, after 2 weeks of intense negotiations, COP26 concluded in November with all countries agreeing to the Glasgow Climate Pact. The Glasgow Climate Pact made significant progress on mitigation, on adaptation, on finance, and it finalized the outstanding elements of the Paris Agreement. Much of the ambition seen in that pact is a direct result of the efforts of small island developing states. The agreement included the first negotiated references to phasing down coal power and to ending fossil fuel subsidies in the UNFCCC's history. At the same time, 64 countries came together to make a coal phase-out commitment. We are increasingly seeing the end, not just of international public coal finance, but of all international support for fossil fuels. At COP, 34 countries and 5 public finance institutions followed the UK's lead in ending international support for the entire unabated fossil fuel energy sector this year, 2022, so that we can make more resources available for the low carbon energy transition. These commitments demonstrate what we already know. The rapid development of renewable energy, coupled with the falling price of renewable electricity, has accelerated the low emission transition. Renewable power generation is already cheaper than coal in most countries. It also contributes to cleaner air and creates more jobs for the future. Renewables accounted for more than 82% of global power capacity additions in 2020. We saw the benefits of this accelerating transition in Glasgow. Nations of all descriptions now believe that they can be more ambitious than they thought possible even just a few years ago. At Glasgow, we secured a near global commitment to net zero, with 90% of the world's GDP and the world's emissions now covered by net zero commitments. That's up from just 30% 2 years ago. Private financial institutions and central banks are moving to realign trillions towards global net zero. Serious players like the shipping company Maersk are bringing forward their own net zero targets, and in Maersk's case from 2050 to 2040. But we can't simply set a net zero target that is decades in the future and do nothing today. In order to reach net zero, we need countries to raise their ambitions now, and we know that's vitally important for the climate. And importantly, by Glasgow, 153 countries had put forward new 2030 emissions targets. Now, the Glasgow Climate Pact requires all countries to revisit and strengthen their nationally determined contributions this year in 2022 in order to align with the Paris Agreement. The increasing incidence of deadly tropical storms, which the Caribbean community continues to suffer, reminds us that, alongside efforts to reduce emissions, progress on adaptation is essential as we move towards net zero. And as you know too well, even if we keep global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees centigrade, countries will still have to adapt very significantly to the changing climate. The agreement of the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work programme on the global goal on adaptation is significant in this regard for driving action on adaptation. Record amounts of adaptation finance were pledged in Glasgow, and donor countries committed to doubling 2019 levels of adaptation finance by 2025. And this was the first time an adaptation-specific financing goal has ever been agreed globally within the UNFCCC. We all know that the transition to net zero will require considerable and predictable climate finance. The Climate Finance Delivery Plan, published in October 2021 by the COP presidency, provided clarity on when and how developed countries will meet the $100 billion climate finance goal. And in Glasgow, parties also agreed to begin the process of setting a new collective quantified post-2025 goal in an open, inclusive and transparent manner. This includes taking into account the needs and priorities of developing countries, as well as considerations of quantity, quality, scope and access to finance. But we also know that it's not public sector billions, but rather private sector trillions that will enable us to deliver on our climate goals. Solar power plants, wind farms, battery storage facilities, zero emission vehicles will all be constructed by the private sector, not by governments. And so working with the private sector was a huge focus at COP26, and it must continue to be central to our efforts. Finally, the issue of loss and damage was a critical issue at COP26, and it's been a focus of our presidency and will continue to be throughout this year. It's particularly pertinent in disaster-prone areas such as the Caribbean, and the inclusion of a section on loss and damage in the Glasgow Climate Pact paves the way for a new phase of work focused on action. I therefore believe we must build on this historic agreement to support those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Under our presidency, we will ensure that progress continues to be made through the new Glasgow Dialogue and that the Santiago network gets up and running. As I said at the start, the voice of climate vulnerable countries has been critical to achieving these important outcomes. And we're proud to note that all Caribbean countries sent delegations to COP26 and that the majority of Caribbean leaders attended the World Leaders Summit. I think it's fair to say that Prime Minister Motley's speech at the opening ceremony of COP26 set the tone for the entire conference. And I'm glad to see that she has also been a part of this conference here in Guyana. At COP26 itself, CARICOM and its members were strongly represented at the remarkable Caribbean Community Climate Change Centre Pavilion. And throughout the conference, the Caribbean passionately advocated for the importance of keeping 1.5 degrees C alive. They emphasised the reality that every point of a degree beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius will have costly consequences, not just for the Caribbean region, but also around the world. Even 1.8 degrees centigrade represents a climate disaster, which will require urgent adaptation investments. And this message of 1.5 degrees is one that the UK has been committed and will continue to be committed to supporting. Now, whilst COP26 achieved a great deal, at this point, the Glasgow Climate Pact is just words on a page. Now we move towards delivery. We must deliver. The 1.5 must remain alive, but only with urgent action across all pillars of the Paris Agreement will that be possible. 2022 must be a year of further action and ambition, where we move beyond commitments and into implementation. I want you all to know that we plan to use our coming presidency year to its fullest. We are all accountable for the commitments made in Glasgow, and we will work with all parties to deliver on those commitments and to go further and faster to close the gap to a 1.5 degrees C pathway. This work will include working with countries to explore further sectoral action in cash, coal, cars and trees, and public and private opportunities for investing in a low carbon, resilient transition. The science on climate change is clearer than ever before. To keep global warming below 1.5 degrees C, we must build a world that is overwhelmingly fossil fuel free by 2050, and we need to be accelerating the transition to that world now. We need to decarbonize the global economy 3 to 5 times faster this decade than we have over the previous 2 decades. And the International Energy Agency's net zero by 2050 roadmap shows that to get there, we need global electricity systems to be virtually net zero by 2040. But we also know that future prosperity lies in clean energy investment. There is a clear economic and development case for redoubling our efforts. Boosting investments in renewables is vital not only to climate action, but it will create jobs, drive economic growth, and reduce air pollution. Wind and solar are now cheaper than new coal and gas power plants in 2/3 of the world. Solar power is the cheapest form of electricity the world has ever known. And this dramatic cost reduction over the last decade, 85% in the case of solar power, has transformed global energy options, particularly in the very poorest countries. Investments in renewables now will pay dividends in the form of greater economic and environmental security in the short term and in the longer term future, just as the current gas crisis in Europe demonstrates. But of course, jobs will also disappear as we abandon fossil fuels. Fossil fuel sectors will take up a reduced share of our economy. We must therefore take steps to ensure that every community benefits from the transition, and that even those who are currently intensively involved in fossil fuels must be enabled to benefit from the transition to a low carbon economy. This will require carefully designed policies to support a managed shift away from older forms of energy generation and to sustain those communities who've derived their livelihoods from fossil fuels. Global solidarity will be critical. We will need to do more to provide everyone with the necessary technologies, expertise, investment support, and financial strategies to make the shift. Guyana has held historically impressive climate credentials, and I know that Vice President Bharat Jagdeo has been instrumental in drafting the revised low carbon development strategy. Initiatives such as these will pave the way for a reduction in emissions and to help adapt against the impacts of climate change. I encourage all sectors of society to take part in the LCDS national consultation. The fight against climate change is a challenge that involves everybody, not just government. We know that for many countries in the Caribbean, the transition to clean energy will require finance and investment. In that regard, COP26 saw the launch of the Energy Transition Council and the Rapid Response Facility, which will deliver fast-acting technical assistance to developing countries seeking to make that transition. The UK's work on the Access to Finance Task Force, alongside our co-chair, Fiji, will continue to be a priority for my country in 2022. We want to bring countries, development banks, investors, and civil society together to strengthen the clean power investment and assistance offer to all countries. And with their help, clean power can become the most attractive option for new power generation everywhere in the world. I know that for Guyana, with its recent discovery of oil, a transition away from fossil fuels may feel impossible. However, the truth is that long-term growth is founded in investment in cleaner and greener energy. This country has a unique opportunity, and an opportunity to use its phenomenal growth in GDP to invest in a clean recovery now, building resilience into its energy grid and providing a sustainable future for its people. The alternative is to invest in what will in the future become stranded assets. As some of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, Caribbean expertise on mitigation, on adaptation, finance and loss and damage will continue to be critical as the work continues on these issues this year. Caribbean countries are global climate leaders and energy producers who are keenly pursuing development and climate goals. And these factors make Caribbean countries important partners in the transition to a net zero world. The UK will continue to work closely with the Caribbean, advocating for further and faster action. Through the NDC Partnership Programme, we will continue to work with your members to not only deliver ambitious NDCs, but also to turn them into a reality. And the UK's Caribbean Development Programme will continue its focus on adaptation and resilience. In the sphere of trade, we will facilitate and promote the Caribbean as a prime region for investment, delivering a pipeline of British expertise and business to support clean growth. CARICOM and Caribbean member states will remain integral partners for the UK in the year ahead and beyond, and throughout the entire UNFCCC process. We know that Glasgow was just the beginning. We know that in order to continue to keep 1.5 degrees C alive, the real work needs to begin now. And we're excited to enter the next phase of this work with you, our Caribbean partners.
Thank you very much, Dr. John Murton. In keeping